You think you know what rebellion looks like? Wait until you meet Elias, the slave who turned Charleston's most powerful plantation into a battlefield with just one swing of his fist. Stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about courage. The crack of leather against flesh had echoed through Magnolia Grove plantation for 23 years, but tonight, something different hung in the humid Charleston air. Elias Washington stood in the cotton field, his dark eyes fixed on Overseer Marcus Thornfield's raised whip, and for the first time in his 19 years of life, he felt no fear. "You gonna pick that cotton, boy? Or do I need to remind you what happens to lazy niggers on this plantation?" Thornfield's voice dripped with the casual cruelty that had broken countless souls before Elias. The other slaves working nearby slowed their movements, sensing the electricity in the air. Sarah, an elderly woman who had watched Elias grow from a defiant child into an even more defiant young man, whispered a prayer under her breath. She had seen this look in his eyes before, but never this intense, never this final. Elias straightened his back, his 6-foot frame casting a long shadow in the moonlight. "I ain't picking no more cotton for you, Thornfield. Not tonight. Not ever again." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. In 1841, Charleston, such defiance from a slave was not just rebellion, it was suicide. But Elias had reached that point where survival meant less than dignity, where the weight of secrets he carried had finally given him the strength to stand. Thornfield's face twisted into a mask of rage. "What did you just say to me, boy?" "You heard me clear enough." Elias's voice was steady, each word measured and deliberate. "I said I ain't your boy no more." The whip came down with vicious speed, but this time, instead of accepting the blow, Elias caught the leather in his bare hand. The crack of his palm against the whip echoed across the field like a gunshot. For a moment, time stopped. Every slave within earshot froze, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Thornfield's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed with murderous intent. "You just signed your death warrant, nigger." But Elias wasn't done. With a swift motion that spoke of careful planning rather than impulsive rage, he yanked the whip from Thornfield's grip and wrapped it around the overseer's throat. Not tight enough to kill, Elias was too smart for that, but tight enough to send a message that would echo through every slave quarter, from Charleston to Savannah. "Listen to me real careful, Thornfield," Elias whispered, his lips close to the overseer's ear. "I know things about this plantation, about Master Wilfred, about what happened to Samuel 3 years ago, things that would make your blood run cold. You touch me again, you touch any of us again the way you've been doing, and I promise you, those secrets gonna find their way to the right ears." Thornfield struggled against the leather, his face turning red, but Elias held firm. Around them, the other slaves watched in terrified fascination. They had never seen anyone, black or white, stand up to Thornfield like this. "You think Master Wilfred gonna protect you when he finds out what I know?" Elias continued, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You think he gonna choose you over keeping his family name clean?" With that, Elias released the whip and stepped back. Thornfield stumbled, gasping for air, his hand instinctively going to his throat. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, predator and prey, but now it was unclear who was which. "This ain't over," Thornfield rasped, but there was something different in his voice now. Fear, uncertainty. "No," Elias agreed, his eyes never leaving the overseer's face. "It ain't, but it's gonna end different than you think." As Thornfield stumbled away into the darkness, muttering threats and curses, the slaves slowly returned to their work. But everything had changed. Sarah approached Elias, her weathered hands shaking. "Child, what have you done?" she whispered. "They're gonna kill you for this." Elias looked at her with eyes that seemed far older than his 19 years. "Maybe. But some things worse than dying, Sarah. Some secrets too heavy to carry alone." "What secrets, Elias? What you talking about?" But Elias was already walking away, his tall frame disappearing into the shadows between the cotton rows. "You'll know soon enough. We all will." As the night deepened around Magnolia Grove, word of Elias's defiance spread through the slave quarters like wildfire. Some whispered that he had finally lost his mind. Others said he had found something worth dying for. But all of them knew that by morning, Master James Wilfred would know what had happened, and when he did, blood would flow. In the big house, James Wilfred sat in his study, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to crumble. The 45-year-old plantation owner prided himself on running the most profitable and orderly plantation in Charleston County. His slaves were well-fed, his overseers efficient, and his reputation spotless. He had no idea that walking through his cotton fields was a young man who possessed the power to destroy everything he had built. But Elias knew. As he made his way to the old slave quarters where he had been born, he carried with him a secret that had been passed down through whispered conversations and hidden letters. A secret about a murder, a cover-up, and a family legacy built on blood. A secret that, once revealed, would prove that even in the darkest corners of the antebellum South, truth had a way of fighting back. The rebellion had begun not with armies or weapons, but with one young man's refusal to remain silent. And as the first light of dawn began to creep across the Charleston sky, everyone at Magnolia Grove, master and slave alike, would wake to discover that their world had changed forever. The question was no longer whether Elias would survive his defiance. The question was whether anyone else would survive what he was about to reveal. The cypress trees hold secrets in Charleston, and today they're about to whisper Elias's name. What happens in the next few hours will determine whether his rebellion dies with him or ignites something that will burn down everything James Wilfred has built. Don't look away. The truth is darker than you imagine. Dawn broke over Magnolia Grove like a wound across the sky, painting the plantation in shades of blood and gold. James Wilfred stood on his mansion's wraparound porch, his coffee growing cold in his hands, as Marcus Thornfield approached with news that would shatter his morning calm. "Master Wilfred, we got ourselves a problem," Thornfield said, his voice still hoarse from the previous night's encounter. The red marks around his neck told their own story. Wilfred's pale blue eyes narrowed as he studied his overseer's appearance. At 45, James Wilfred had inherited Magnolia Grove from his father and had spent 20 years perfecting the art of control. Every slave knew their place, every overseer followed orders without question, and every neighbor respected the Wilfred name. Disorder was not tolerated. "Explain," Wilfred commanded, his voice carrying the cold authority that had made him one of Charleston's most feared plantation owners. Thornfield recounted the previous night's events, his hands trembling slightly as he described Elias's defiance. With each word, Wilfred's expression grew darker, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out like cords beneath his pale skin. "And he mentioned secrets?" Wilfred asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Yes, sir. Said he knew things about you, about what happened to Samuel 3 years ago. Said he'd tell the right people if I touched him again." The coffee cup slipped from Wilfred's fingers, shattering against the porch boards. For a moment, the only sound was the distant singing of slaves beginning their morning work, their voices carrying across the fields like a funeral dirge. "Bring him to me," Wilfred said finally. "Now!" But when Thornfield and 2 other overseers reached the slave quarters, they found Elias's small cabin empty. His few possessions, a worn Bible, a carved wooden cross, and a small bundle of letters tied with string, were gone. It was as if he had vanished into the morning mist that rose from the nearby swamplands. "Search every inch of this plantation," Wilfred ordered when they returned empty-handed. "Check the fields, the barns, the smokehouse. Find him." The search lasted 3 hours. They found nothing. It wasn't until young Timothy, the stable boy, mentioned seeing someone walking toward the old cypress grove near the swamp that they had a direction. The grove was a place most slaves avoided, a dark tangle of ancient trees where Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds and the water ran black as sin. Wilfred himself led the search party into the grove, his expensive boots squelching in the muddy ground. The cypress trees rose around them like cathedral pillars, their massive trunks disappearing into the canopy above. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of decay, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the splash of alligators moving through the dark water. "There," Thornfield whispered, pointing toward a structure barely visible through the trees. It was an old storage building, built decades ago when the plantation was first established. The wooden walls were gray with age and covered in moss, and the roof sagged dangerously. Most people had forgotten it existed, but Elias had found it, and more importantly, he had found what was hidden inside. They approached carefully, weapons drawn. Wilfred's heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear of Elias, but from fear of what the young slave might have discovered in that forgotten building. The door hung open, creaking softly in the humid breeze. Inside, they found Elias sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by papers and documents that should have been destroyed years ago. His dark eyes looked up at them without surprise, as if he had been expecting this moment. "Master Wilfred," Elias said calmly, his voice echoing in the small space. "I've been waiting for you." Wilfred's eyes swept over the scattered papers, and his blood turned to ice. Letters bearing his father's handwriting, bills of sale with forged signatures, and most damning of all, a detailed confession written in his own hand 3 years ago and hidden away where he thought no one would ever find it. "How did you—" Wilfred began, but his voice failed him. "Samuel told me where to look before you killed him," Elias said simply. "He knew you'd come for him eventually, knew you couldn't let him live with what he'd seen. So he made sure someone else would know the truth." The confession detailed everything. How Wilfred's father had murdered a free black man who had threatened to expose the family's illegal slave trading operations. How young James had helped cover up the crime. How Samuel, a trusted house slave, had witnessed the burial and kept silent for 20 years until his conscience finally broke. Samuel was going to tell the authorities, Elias continued, his voice steady despite the guns pointed at him. "Was going to expose how your daddy built this plantation on blood money and murder. So you poisoned him, made it look like fever, but he knew it was coming, and he told me everything." Wilfred's face had gone white as bone. Around him, his overseers shifted nervously, beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were hearing. This wasn't just about a rebellious slave. This was about murder, conspiracy, and the destruction of one of Charleston's most prominent families. "You have no proof," Wilfred said, but his voice lacked conviction. Elias smiled, a cold expression that transformed his young face into something ancient and terrible. "I got Samuel's dying words, written down and witnessed. I got copies of these papers hidden where you'll never find them. And I got something else you ain't even thought of yet." "What?" "I got time. See, you can kill me right here, right now. Probably will. But them papers gonna find their way to the Charleston authorities, whether I'm alive or dead. Samuel made sure of that. Set up a whole system, he did. Letters to be delivered, people to be contacted. You kill me, and it all starts moving like clockwork." The silence in the old building was deafening. Outside, the cypress trees swayed in the breeze, their branches creaking like old bones. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird sang, its voice echoing through the swamp like a funeral song. Wilfred raised his pistol, his hand shaking with rage and fear. "You're lying." "Maybe," Elias said, still smiling, "but are you willing to bet your family's reputation on it? Are you willing to bet your life?" For a long moment, master and slave stared at each other across the small space, surrounded by the evidence of decades of crime and corruption. The other men held their breath, waiting to see which way the moment would break. Finally, Wilfred lowered his weapon. "Take him to the punishment shed," he ordered. "Lock him up, I need time to think." As the overseers moved to grab Elias, the young slave stood slowly, his movements deliberate and unafraid. "You can lock me up, Master Wilfred. You can beat me, torture me, even kill me. But you can't stop what's already been set in motion. The truth got a way of coming out, no matter how deep you try to bury it." They dragged him from the building, but his words lingered in the humid air like a curse. As Wilfred gathered up the scattered papers with shaking hands, he realized that his carefully ordered world was crumbling around him. The rebellion that had started with one slave's defiance was about to become something much larger, much more dangerous. In the distance, the cypress trees whispered their ancient secrets to the wind, and somewhere in their shadows, the ghost of Samuel smiled. Death has been stalking Magnolia Grove for 3 years, and tonight, it's finally ready to collect. What happens when the dead refuse to stay buried will shake this plantation to its very foundations. Keep watching. The real horror is just beginning. The punishment shed stood like a monument to human cruelty at the edge of Magnolia Grove's slave quarters. Built from rough-hewn cypress planks and reinforced with iron bars, it had witnessed more suffering than any structure should bear. Tonight, as Elias sat chained to its walls, the building seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, as if all the pain it had contained was finally ready to break free. 3 days had passed since his capture in the cypress grove. 3 days of bread and water, of James Wilfred's increasingly desperate visits, of whispered threats and promises that fell on deaf ears. Elias had said nothing more about Samuel's insurance policy, had revealed nothing about where the copies of the documents were hidden. He simply sat in the darkness, waiting. In the big house, Wilfred paced his study like a caged animal. The original documents from the Grove sat locked in his safe, but their existence haunted him. Every creak of the old mansion made him jump. Every shadow seemed to hide an accuser. His wife Margaret had begun asking questions about his behavior, and his teenage daughter Caroline watched him with growing concern. "James, you've barely eaten in days," Margaret said, as she entered the study carrying a tray of food. Her delicate features were creased with worry, and her usually perfect blonde hair showed signs of distress. "What's troubling you so?" Wilfred looked up from his desk, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Plantation business. Nothing for you to concern yourself with." But Margaret wasn't easily dismissed. She had been married to James for 20 years and had learned to read the signs of his various moods. This was different. This was fear. "It's about that slave, isn't it? The one they have locked up. The servants are talking, James. They're saying he knows things, dangerous things." Before Wilfred could respond, a tremendous crash echoed through the house, followed by the sound of splintering wood and Margaret's scream. They rushed toward the noise, finding its source in the main parlor. The massive crystal chandelier that had hung in the Wilfred family for 3 generations lay shattered across the floor, its hundreds of pieces catching the lamplight like fallen stars. Above, the ceiling showed no sign of damage, no indication of what could have caused such a catastrophe. "How is this possible?" Margaret whispered, her hand pressed to her throat. Wilfred stared at the destruction, his mind racing. The chandelier had been inspected just last month. The chains were solid iron, the mounting secure. There was no earthly reason for it to fall. "Must have been a structural weakness," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'll have the workers examine the other fixtures tomorrow." As they stood among the glittering debris, Caroline appeared in the doorway, her young face pale with shock. "Papa, what happened?" "It sounded like thunder." "Just an accident, sweetheart. Go back to your room." But Caroline didn't move. Instead, she stared at the destruction with an expression that chilled Wilfred to the bone. "Samuel used to polish that chandelier," she said quietly. "Every week he'd climb up there and make it shine. He said it was the most beautiful thing in the house." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and Wilfred felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Caroline, go to your room now." This time his daughter obeyed, but her words lingered in the air like an accusation. Samuel. Always Samuel. Even in death, the old slave seemed determined to haunt them. As the family retired for the night, leaving the servants to clean up the destruction, strange things began happening throughout the plantation. In the slave quarters, people reported hearing footsteps on the roof, the sound of chains dragging across wooden floors, and most disturbing of all, the voice of Samuel singing the old spirituals he had loved in life. Sarah, the elderly woman who had tried to warn Elias, sat by her small window and listened to the ghostly singing with tears streaming down her face. She had loved Samuel like a brother, had mourned his death for 3 years, and now she understood that his spirit had never truly left Magnolia Grove. "He's trying to tell us something?" she whispered to her cabin mate, a young woman named Ruth. "Samuel's trying to warn us about what's coming." In the punishment shed, Elias heard the singing too. But unlike the others, he wasn't afraid. He had been expecting this. Samuel had told him it would happen, had explained that the dead don't rest easy when justice remains undone. "I hear you, old friend," Elias whispered into the darkness. "I know you're ready, we're all ready." The singing grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to fill every corner of the plantation. In the big house, Wilfred sat bolt upright in his bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The melody was unmistakable. "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," Samuel's favorite hymn. But Samuel was dead. Wilfred had watched him die, had seen the poison do its work, had personally supervised the burial in the slave cemetery. This was impossible. He rose from his bed and walked to the window, looking out over the moonlit plantation. Everything appeared normal. The slave quarters dark and quiet, the fields stretching away into the distance, the cypress grove standing like a wall of shadows against the night sky. Then he saw him. A figure stood beneath the great oak tree in the front yard, tall and dignified, wearing the simple clothes of a house slave. Even in the moonlight, Wilfred could make out the familiar features, the graying hair, the proud bearing, the gentle eyes that had once looked at him with something approaching affection. Samuel. The ghost turned toward the house, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. Samuel's mouth moved, forming words that Wilfred couldn't hear but somehow understood. "The truth will out, Master James. The truth will out." Then the figure faded, leaving only shadows and the echo of singing that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Wilfred stumbled backward from the window, his breath coming in short gasps. This couldn't be happening. Dead men didn't return. Ghosts were superstition, the foolish beliefs of ignorant slaves. But even as he tried to rationalize what he had seen, he knew the truth. Samuel had returned, and his presence meant only one thing: time was running out. In the punishment shed, Elias smiled in the darkness. The first phase of Samuel's plan was complete. The haunting had begun, and with it, the psychological pressure that would drive Wilfred to make the mistakes that would ultimately destroy him. "You feel it now, don't you, Master?" Elias whispered. "You feel the weight of what you've done. Samuel ain't gonna rest, and neither are the others. All them souls you and your daddy sent to early graves, they all coming home now." As if in response to his words, the temperature in the shed dropped dramatically. Elias's breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and he could hear the sound of chains rattling, not from his own shackles, but from somewhere beyond the walls. The dead were gathering at Magnolia Grove, drawn by the promise of justice and the power of truth, and at the center of it all sat a young slave who had become something more than human. He had become the instrument of divine retribution. The rebellion was no longer just about freedom. It was about accountability, about the settling of debts that had been accumulating for decades. And as the night deepened around the plantation, everyone, living and dead, prepared for the reckoning that was to come. Freedom isn't just about breaking chains. Sometimes it's about embracing the very thing your oppressors fear most. Tonight, Elias will show his people that there are fates worse than death and powers greater than any master's whip. Stay close, because what you're about to witness will redefine everything you thought you knew about courage. The fourth dawn since Elias's imprisonment broke gray and sullen over Magnolia Grove, but the slaves who gathered for morning prayers felt something different in the air. Word of the previous night's supernatural events had spread through the quarters like wildfire, and with it came a strange new emotion that none of them had dared feel in years: hope. Sarah stood before the small group assembled in the shadow of the old oak tree, her weathered hands clasped tightly together. At 73, she was the oldest slave on the plantation and had seen more suffering than any human should endure. But this morning, her eyes held a light that hadn't been there in decades. "Children," she began, her voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom, "last night we all heard Samuel singing. We all felt his presence walking among us. And we all know what it means." The assembled slaves, field hands, house servants, children barely old enough to work, nodded solemnly. They had grown up with stories of spirits returning to settle unfinished business, of the dead refusing to rest until justice was served. "But it ain't just Samuel," continued Ruth, a young woman who worked in the big house. "Miss Caroline told me her papa been acting strange for days, jumping at shadows, talking to himself, barely eating. Whatever Elias knows, it got Master Wilfred scared. Scared enough to kill us all if he thinks we know too much," warned Moses, a field hand whose back bore the scars of countless whippings. "Y'all remember what happened to Samuel. Master Wilfred don't hesitate to silence folks permanent-like." But Sarah shook her head, her expression serene despite the danger they all faced. "That's where you wrong, Moses. See? Elias ain't like the rest of us. That boy ain't afraid of dying. And when a man ain't afraid of death, he becomes something else entirely. He becomes free." As if summoned by her words, a commotion arose from the direction of the punishment shed. Thornfield and two other overseers were approaching, their faces grim with purpose. The slaves scattered quickly, returning to their morning duties, but the seed of rebellion that Sarah had planted continued to grow. In the shed, Elias sat exactly as he had for 4 days, his back straight despite the chains, his eyes clear despite the lack of proper food and sleep. When Thornfield entered with his companions, Elias looked up at them with something approaching pity. "Morning, gentlemen," he said pleasantly. "Come to chat again?" Thornfield's face was haggard, marked by sleepless nights and growing fear. The supernatural events of the previous evening had shaken him badly, and he was beginning to understand that this situation was beyond his experience. "Master Wilfred wants to make you a deal," Thornfield said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "You tell us where them papers are hidden and he'll give you a quick death, clean bullet to the head, no torture, no suffering." Elias laughed, a sound so rich and genuine that it seemed to fill the small building with warmth. "A quick death, that's his offer. Lord have mercy, that man really don't understand what he's dealing with, do he? What's that supposed to mean?" Elias leaned forward as much as his chains would allow, his dark eyes boring into Thornfield's soul. "It means death ain't the worst thing that can happen to a man. Living with the weight of evil, knowing that every breath you take is stolen from someone else's lungs, that's worse than dying. And your master Wilfred, he's been living that life for 3 years now. You're talking nonsense." "Am I? Then why he ain't sleeping? Why he jumping at every sound, seeing ghosts in every shadow? Why that chandelier fell last night with no earthly cause?" Thornfield's face went pale. News of the chandelier's destruction had spread quickly through the overseer ranks, and none of them could explain it. "You did that somehow," Thornfield accused. "You and your voodoo nonsense." Elias shook his head slowly. "I didn't do nothing but tell the truth. Samuel's the one doing the haunting. Samuel and all the others your master killed over the years. See, the dead got their own kind of justice, and it don't require courts or judges or juries. It just requires truth." As he spoke, the temperature in the shed began to drop. The 3 white men looked around nervously as their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. "You feel that?" Elias asked softly. "That's the chill of the grave, gentlemen. That's the touch of souls who ain't at rest, and they ain't gonna rest until the truth comes out." One of the overseers, a young man named Peters, backed toward the door. "This ain't natural," he whispered. "This ain't right." But Elias wasn't finished. "You want to know what real power looks like? It ain't the power to own another man's body. It ain't the power to buy and sell human souls. Real power is the power to choose your own death, to decide what you're willing to die for, and I choose to die for the truth." The chains around his wrists began to rattle, though Elias hadn't moved. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to echo from every corner of the building. "Samuel!" Elias called out, his voice rising above the supernatural cacophony. "Samuel, show these men what justice looks like." The door to the shed slammed shut with tremendous force, trapping the 4 men inside. The rattling of chains grew deafening, and suddenly the air was filled with voices, dozens of them, hundreds of them, all singing the same mournful spiritual that had echoed across the plantation the night before. Thornfield and his men pressed themselves against the walls, their eyes wide with terror. But Elias sat calmly in the center of the chaos, his face serene, his voice joining the ghostly chorus. "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." The singing reached a crescendo, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The door swung open, revealing a crowd of slaves who had been drawn by the supernatural commotion. They stared in amazement at the 3 white men cowering against the walls, and at Elias, who sat among his chains like a king on his throne. "Tell your master," Elias said quietly, his words carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "that the dead are gathering. Tell him that Samuel ain't alone no more, and tell him that if he wants this to stop, he knows what he has to do." Thornfield and his men fled the shed, pushing through the crowd of slaves in their haste to escape. But the slaves didn't move. They stood transfixed, staring at Elias, with a mixture of awe and understanding. "You ain't afraid," whispered a young field hand named Joshua. "You really ain't afraid of nothing." Elias smiled, and in that smile was all the warmth and love that had been beaten out of so many of his people. "Fear is a choice, Joshua, and I choose not to be afraid. I choose to be free, even if it kills me." Sarah pushed through the crowd, her old eyes bright with tears. "Child, what you doing? What you trying to accomplish?" "I'm showing them that we ain't just bodies to be owned," Elias replied. "I'm showing them that we got souls and spirits and the power to choose our own destiny, even if that destiny is death." As the crowd dispersed, each slave carrying with them a new understanding of what freedom truly meant, Elias settled back against the wall of his prison. The supernatural events of the morning had served their purpose. They had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of his captors and seeds of hope in the hearts of his people. But more importantly, they had demonstrated a truth that would echo through the generations, that the human spirit, once awakened to its own power, could not be chained, could not be broken, and could not be silenced. The ghost of freedom was walking through Magnolia Grove, and its name was Truth. Some sins are too heavy for the grave to hold, and tonight James Wilfred will learn that his father's legacy is written in blood that refuses to dry. What Elias reveals in the next few minutes will shatter a family's reputation and expose the rotting foundation of Charleston's most respected plantation. The truth has been buried for 23 years, but the dead remember everything. The grandfather clock in James Wilfred's study chimed midnight as he sat hunched over his desk, a half-empty bottle of bourbon at his elbow and a loaded pistol within easy reach. 5 days had passed since Elias's capture, and each night had brought fresh horrors, footsteps in empty rooms, voices calling his name from the darkness, and always, the sound of Samuel singing. Margaret had taken Caroline to her sister's house in Charleston that morning, claiming the plantation had become unhealthy for their daughter. She hadn't said it directly, but Wilfred knew she blamed him for whatever supernatural plague had descended upon their home. A soft knock at the study door made him jump, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol. "Come in," he called, his voice hoarse from sleepless nights and too much whiskey. Thornfield entered, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. The overseer had aged 10 years in 5 days, and his usual swagger had been replaced by nervous, darting glances at every shadow. "He wants to see you," Thornfield said without preamble. "Says he's ready to talk, but only to you, alone." Wilfred's blood ran cold. He had been dreading this moment, knowing it would come, but hoping against hope that he could find another solution. "Did he say, what about?" "Your father. Says it's time you knew the whole truth about what happened 23 years ago." The bottle slipped from Wilfred's nerveless fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor and filling the room with the sharp scent of bourbon. 23 years ago. The year his father had died, the year everything had changed. "Sir?" Thornfield's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Should I tell him you'll come?" Wilfred nodded slowly, his mind reeling. He had always known there were secrets surrounding his father's death, gaps in the story that never quite made sense, but he had been content to let sleeping dogs lie, to enjoy the wealth and status that his inheritance had provided. Now, it seemed, those sleeping dogs were about to wake up and bite him. The walk to the punishment shed felt like a journey to the gallows. The night air was thick with humidity and the scent of jasmine, but underneath it all, Wilfred could smell something else, the cloying sweetness of decay, as if the very earth was rotting beneath his feet. Elias sat exactly where he had for 5 days, but something about him had changed. There was a gravity to his presence now, a weight that seemed to press down on everything around him. When he looked up at Wilfred, his eyes held the accumulated wisdom of generations. "Master Wilfred," Elias said softly, "thank you for coming. I know this ain't easy for you." "Get on with it," Wilfred snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. "Say what you have to say." Elias was quiet for a long moment, studying the white man's face with something approaching compassion. "Your daddy ever tell you about Jeremiah Freeman?" The name hit Wilfred like a physical blow. Jeremiah Freeman, he had heard it whispered in dark corners, seen it written in his father's private papers, but had never understood its significance. "I see you recognize the name," Elias continued. "Jeremiah was a free black man, educated, well-spoken. Had himself a little farm about 10 miles north of here, but more than that, he had something your daddy wanted real bad." "What?" "Information." See, Jeremiah had been keeping records, names, dates, transactions. He knew which plantation owners were buying slaves illegal-like, which ones were forging papers, which ones were selling free blacks into bondage, and he was planning to take all that information to the federal authorities. Wilfred's legs felt weak. He leaned against the doorframe, his mind racing as pieces of a puzzle he had never wanted to solve began falling into place. "Your daddy was deep in that illegal trade," Elias continued relentlessly, "deeper than most. Had ships coming in from Africa long after the trade was banned, had connections with pirates and slavers all up and down the coast. Jeremiah Freeman had enough evidence to hang him 10 times over." "You're lying," Wilfred whispered. But even as he said it, he knew it was true. Too many things suddenly made sense. His father's mysterious business trips, the locked rooms in the house, the way certain visitors were always received in secret. "Samuel was there the night your daddy went to see Jeremiah," Elias said, his voice gentle but implacable. "Took Samuel along as a driver, thinking he was just another ignorant slave who wouldn't understand what was happening. But Samuel was smart, Master Wilfred. Smarter than your daddy ever gave him credit for." The shed seemed to grow colder as Elias spoke, and Wilfred could swear he heard the whisper of wind through cypress trees, though the night was still. "Your daddy tried to buy Jeremiah's silence first, offered him money, land, even his freedom papers if he'd just disappear. But Jeremiah was a righteous man, said the truth needed to come out, said too many people had suffered for too long." "So what happened?" Wilfred's voice was barely audible. "Your daddy killed him, shot him right there in his own parlor, with Samuel watching from the doorway. Then he made it look like a robbery, took some valuables to sell the story. But he made one mistake." "What mistake?" Elias smiled sadly. "He trusted Samuel to keep quiet. Figured a slave wouldn't dare speak against his master, no matter what he'd seen. And for 20 years, Samuel did keep quiet, carried that burden in his heart, watched your daddy get rich and respected, while Jeremiah Freeman rotted in an unmarked grave. The temperature in the shed had dropped so dramatically that Wilfred's breath was now visible in the air. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the walls, he could hear the sound of footsteps, slow, measured, deliberate. But Samuel's conscience finally broke, Elias continued, started having dreams about Jeremiah, started seeing his face in every free black man who passed through Charleston. So he came to your daddy 3 years ago, told him he couldn't carry the secret no more. Said he was going to tell the truth, no matter what happened to him. And my father? Your daddy was dead by then, Master Wilfred. This was you. You who decided Samuel had to die. You who put the poison in his food. You who watched him suffer for 3 days before he finally passed." The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence. Wilfred stared at Elias, his mind reeling, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I had no choice," he whispered. "If the truth had come out, it would have destroyed everything. My family, my reputation, my children's future. So you chose to destroy Samuel instead. He was just a slave." The words echoed in the small building, and suddenly the footsteps outside stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pregnant with supernatural menace. "Just a slave," Elias repeated softly. "Just a human being with a soul and a conscience and a family who loved him. Just a man who couldn't live with the weight of your daddy's sin." As he spoke, the door to the shed began to creak open, though no wind stirred the night air. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall, dignified, wearing the simple clothes of a house servant. Samuel's ghost stood there, his eyes fixed on Wilfred with an expression of infinite sadness. "Hello, Master James," the ghost said, his voice carrying clearly despite the fact that his lips didn't move. "I've been waiting a long time to have this conversation." Wilfred stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror. "This isn't real, this isn't happening." "Oh, it's real," Samuel's ghost replied. "Real as the bullet your daddy put in Jeremiah Freeman's chest. Real as the poison you put in my food. Real as the 23 years I've been carrying this burden." Behind Samuel, other figures began to appear, shadowy forms that gradually took on human shape. Jeremiah Freeman, tall and proud even in death. Other slaves who had died under suspicious circumstances over the years, all of them staring at Wilfred with eyes that demanded justice. "The truth is coming out, Master James," Samuel said. "One way or another, the truth is coming out. You can tell it yourself or we can tell it for you. But it's coming out." Wilfred fell to his knees, his mind finally snapping under the weight of guilt and supernatural terror. "What do you want from me?" he sobbed. "What do you want?" Elias's voice cut through the chaos, calm and certain. "Justice, Master Wilfred, nothing more, nothing less. Justice for Samuel, for Jeremiah Freeman, for all the souls your family has destroyed. The question is, are you man enough to give it to them?" As the ghosts pressed closer, their eyes burning with the fire of righteous anger, Wilfred realized that his carefully constructed world was finally, irrevocably, coming to an end. The moment of reckoning has arrived at Magnolia Grove, and tonight the very foundations of the plantation system will crack under the weight of truth. What happens in the next hour will determine whether justice prevails or whether the cycle of violence continues for another generation. Hold your breath. Revolution is about to be born from the ashes of confession. Dawn broke blood red over Magnolia Grove as James Wilfred stumbled from the punishment shed, his mind shattered by the supernatural confrontation with Samuel's ghost. The confession had poured from his lips like poison from a wound. Every detail of his father's crimes, every moment of Samuel's murder, every lie that had built the Wilfred fortune. Elias remained chained in the shed, but his work was done. The truth had been spoken, witnessed by the dead and recorded in the very air of the plantation. Now came the most dangerous part, the moment when truth transformed into action. Word of Wilfred's breakdown spread through the slave quarters like wildfire. Sarah gathered the field hands in the pre-dawn darkness, her weathered face grave with the weight of what was to come. "Children," she whispered, "the time has come." Master Wilfred done confessed to Samuel's murder, and the spirits are walking free. But confession ain't justice. We got to finish what Elias started. Moses, the scarred field hand, shook his head in fear. "Sarah, you talking about revolt? You know what happens to slaves who rise up. They don't just kill us, they kill our families, our children. They make examples that last for generations." "And what about the example we set if we do nothing?" Ruth countered, her young voice fierce with determination. "What about the message we send to our children if we let Master Wilfred walk away from Samuel's murder?" The debate might have continued, but it was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats thundering up the plantation's main drive. Through the morning mist came a sight that chilled every slave's blood. A dozen mounted men armed with rifles and whips, their faces hard with the promise of violence. Thornfield had sent for reinforcements. "Slave catchers," Moses whispered, his face going pale. "Professional killers. They ain't here to talk." The mounted men dismounted near the big house, where Thornfield waited with the other overseers. Their leader, a grizzled man named Calhoun, who was known throughout the South for his brutal efficiency, surveyed the plantation with cold, calculating eyes. "Where's the troublemaker?" Calhoun asked without preamble. "Locked up in the punishment shed," Thornfield replied. "But there's more to this than just one rebellious slave. The whole plantation's been infected with his poison. They're all talking about spirits and justice and God knows what else." Calhoun spat into the dirt. "Spirits, hell. What they need is a reminder of what happens to slaves who forget their place. Round up the ringleaders. We'll make examples of them that'll keep the rest in line for the next 50 years. But as the slave catchers moved toward the quarters, they found something unexpected. The slaves weren't cowering in their cabins. Instead, they stood in the open spaces between the buildings, men, women, and children forming a loose circle around the punishment shed. They carried no weapons, made no threatening moves, but their presence was undeniably defiant. "What the hell is this?" Calhoun muttered, his hand moving instinctively to his pistol. Sarah stepped forward, her aged frame somehow commanding despite her small stature. "We come to witness," she said simply. "Come to see justice done." "Justice?" Calhoun laughed harshly. "The only justice here is what I decide to give you. Now get back to your cabins before I start shooting." But the slaves didn't move. If anything, more appeared from the fields and outbuildings, until nearly every black soul on the plantation stood in silent solidarity around the shed where Elias waited. Inside the building, Elias heard the commotion and smiled. This was what Samuel had foreseen, what all the supernatural manifestations had been building toward. Not just the revelation of truth, but the moment when his people would choose to stand together, regardless of the consequences. "You hear that, Samuel?" he whispered to the empty air. "You hear your people finding their courage?" The ghost of Samuel materialized beside him, his form more solid than it had ever been. "I hear it, son. And I'm proud, prouder than I ever been in life or death." Outside, the confrontation was escalating. Calhoun had drawn his weapon, and his men were following suit. The slaves remained motionless, but their silence was more threatening than any war cry. "I'm going to count to 10, Calhoun announced, his voice carrying across the plantation. "If you're not back in your cabins by then, I start shooting. 1, 2, 3. The count continued, but the slaves held their ground. Children pressed close to their parents. Elderly men and women linked arms with the young and strong, and all of them kept their eyes fixed on the punishment shed where their champion waited. 7, 8, 9. Just as Calhoun reached for the final number, a new voice cut through the tension. "Stop!" James Wilfred emerged from the big house, his clothes disheveled, his face haggard, but his voice carrying the authority of absolute desperation. "Don't shoot them, please." Calhoun lowered his weapon slightly, confusion replacing anger on his weathered features. "What's wrong with you, Wilfred? These slaves are in open rebellion. They need to be put down hard." "No," Wilfred said, his voice growing stronger. "They're not rebelling, they're witnessing, just like she said." He walked slowly toward the crowd of slaves, and as he approached, they parted to create a path to the punishment shed. Every eye followed him, but there was no hatred in their gazes, only a patient expectation that justice would finally be served. At the shed, Wilfred stopped and looked through the barred window at Elias. The young slave sat calmly in his chains, his dark eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed to span generations. "You won," Wilfred said quietly. "The truth is out. Samuel's story will be told. But what happens now? What do you want from me?" Elias considered the question carefully. Around them, the assembled slaves waited in perfect silence, while the armed white men watched with growing unease. "I want you to do what's right," Elias said finally. "Not because you're forced to, not because you're afraid of ghosts or spirits or slave revolts, but because it's right, because Samuel deserves justice, because Jeremiah Freeman deserves to be remembered, because the truth deserves to see daylight." Wilfred closed his eyes, and for a moment the weight of 23 years of lies and guilt seemed to crush him. When he opened them again, something had changed. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something else. Resolution. "Thornfield," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the plantation. "Unlock the shed, release him." "Sir?" Thornfield's voice cracked with disbelief. "You can't be serious. After everything that's happened, I said release him." Calhoun stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. "Wilfred, you've lost your mind. You can't just free a rebellious slave. It sets a precedent that'll spread across the entire South." But Wilfred was no longer listening to the voices of fear and oppression. Instead, he heard something else. The whisper of Samuel's ghost, the echo of his father's crimes, and underneath it all, the quiet dignity of a young slave who had chosen truth over safety. "The precedent was set 23 years ago when my father murdered an innocent man," Wilfred said. "It was reinforced 3 years ago when I murdered Samuel. And it ends today." He took the keys from Thornfield's nerveless fingers and unlocked the shed himself. Elias emerged into the morning sunlight, his chains falling away, his freedom purchased not with violence, but with the simple power of truth. The slaves erupted in celebration, not the wild jubilation of victory, but the quiet joy of justice finally served. They surrounded Elias, touching him, blessing him, thanking him for his courage. But Calhoun wasn't finished. "This is madness," he snarled, raising his rifle. "I won't let one plantation owner's weakness destroy the entire system." The weapon swung toward Elias, but before Calhoun could fire, something extraordinary happened. Every slave on the plantation stepped forward, placing themselves between the gun and their champion. They formed a human wall, dozens of bodies willing to take a bullet to protect the man who had given them hope. Faced with such unified defiance, Calhoun hesitated. He could kill one man, even a dozen, but he couldn't slaughter an entire plantation's worth of slaves without destroying the very property he was supposed to protect. In that moment of hesitation, Elias spoke. "You can shoot me, Mr. Calhoun. You can probably shoot a lot of us, but you can't shoot the truth. And the truth is already spreading, already moving beyond this plantation. Samuel's story, Jeremiah Freeman's story, they're going to be told whether I live or die." As if to emphasize his words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the plantation. But these weren't more slave catchers. These were federal marshals, drawn by anonymous letters that had been circulating through Charleston for "Por favor, continue gerando a sua resposta." Agent Logo Prompt Cartel Days, letters that detailed the crimes of the Wilfred family and demanded justice for the murdered. Calhoun's face went white as he recognized the federal uniforms. The game had changed completely. This was no longer about controlling rebellious slaves. This was about murder, conspiracy, and federal crimes that carried the death penalty. "James Wilfred," called the lead marshal as he dismounted, "you're under arrest for the murder of Samuel Washington and conspiracy in the death of Jeremiah Freeman." The plantation erupted in chaos. Calhoun and his men tried to flee, but found their way blocked by slaves who had suddenly discovered the courage that comes from seeing justice served. Thornfield dropped to his knees, babbling confessions and pleas for mercy. And through it all, Elias stood calm and dignified, the chains of slavery finally broken not by violence, but by the inexorable power of truth. As the marshals led Wilfred away, the plantation owner turned back to look at Elias one final time. "How?" he asked. "How did you know the letters would reach the right people?" Elias smiled, and in that smile was all the wisdom of Samuel, all the righteousness of Jeremiah Freeman, and all the hope of generations yet to come. "Samuel told me something before he died," he said. "He told me that truth is like water. It always finds a way to flow downhill. You can dam it up for a while, but eventually it's going to break through." As the federal marshals disappeared down the plantation drive with their prisoner, the slaves of Magnolia Grove stood together in the morning sunlight, free not just in body, but in spirit. The Great Levante had succeeded not through bloodshed, but through the simple act of refusing to let truth remain buried. And somewhere in the cypress grove, the ghost of Samuel Washington finally smiled and faded into the morning mist. His long vigil ended, his justice served. The rebellion was complete. The truth had set them all free. The flames of truth burned brightest in the darkness, and tonight they will consume the last lies that built an empire on blood. What Elias reveals in these final moments will echo through history, proving that some stories are too powerful to die with their tellers. This is where legends are born from the ashes of justice. 6 months had passed since the arrest of James Wilfred, and Magnolia Grove stood transformed under the autumn sky. The federal investigation had uncovered a network of illegal slave trading that stretched from Charleston to New Orleans, bringing down some of the South's most prominent families. But tonight, as flames danced in the great house's fireplace, the final chapter of this story was about to be written. Elias sat in what had once been Wilfred's study, now serving as a meeting place for the newly freed slaves who had chosen to remain on the plantation as paid workers. The transformation was remarkable. Where once fear and oppression had ruled, now there was hope and dignity. But Elias knew that the most important lesson was yet to be shared. Sarah entered the room, her aged face glowing with a contentment that had seemed impossible just months before. Behind her came Ruth, Moses, Joshua, and dozens of others, the community that had found its courage in the darkness of that terrible dawn. "You called us together, Elias," Sarah said, settling into a chair that had once been reserved for white visitors. "What you got to tell us that's so important it couldn't wait for morning?" Elias looked around the room at the faces of his people, faces that had been marked by suffering but were now bright with possibility. "I got one more secret to share," he said quietly. "The biggest one of all, the one that Samuel made me promise to keep until the time was right." The room fell silent, every person leaning forward to catch his words. Outside, the wind whispered through the cypress trees, carrying with it the memory of all who had suffered and died on this land. "You all know the story of how Samuel witnessed Jeremiah Freeman's murder," Elias began. "Y'all know how he carried that burden for 20 years before his conscience broke, but what y'all don't know is why Samuel really came forward when he did." Ruth frowned. "What you mean?" "He came forward because he couldn't live with the secret no more." "That's part of it," Elias agreed. "But there's more. See, Samuel didn't just witness Jeremiah Freeman's murder. He witnessed something else that night, something that changed everything." The flames in the fireplace seemed to flicker more brightly as Elias spoke, casting dancing shadows on the walls that had once displayed portraits of the Wilfred family. "Jeremiah Freeman wasn't just keeping records of illegal slave trading," Elias continued. "He was part of something bigger, something that would have changed the whole South if it had succeeded." Moses leaned forward, his scarred hands gripping the arms of his chair. "What kind of something?" "A network. A secret organization of free blacks, escaped slaves, and white abolitionists working together to document every crime, every illegal transaction, every murder committed in the name of slavery. Jeremiah was their record keeper for this whole region, but he wasn't working alone. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. These people had lived their entire lives believing they were powerless, isolated, forgotten by the world. The idea that there had been an organized resistance, a network of people fighting for their freedom, was almost too much to comprehend. "Samuel saw the papers that night," Elias continued. "Saw the names, the addresses, the plans. and he memorized every detail. For 20 years, he carried not just the burden of witnessing a murder, but the knowledge of a movement that could have freed every slave in the South. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Why didn't he tell us? Why didn't he share that hope? Because the network was broken when Jeremiah died. The other members scattered, went underground. Some were probably killed. Samuel thought the dream had died with Jeremiah. But 3 years ago, something changed. Elias reached into his shirt and pulled out a small bundle of letters, tied with the same string that had bound Samuel's possessions. These came to Samuel in the months before his death. Letters from up north, from people who had heard whispers of Jeremiah's work and were trying to rebuild the network. He untied the bundle and spread the letters on the desk. Even in the firelight, the words were clear. Correspondence from abolitionists in Boston, Philadelphia, New York. Names that would become famous in the years to come. Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Harriet Tubman. The Underground Railroad was growing, Elias said. The abolition movement was getting stronger, and they needed people like Samuel, people who had been inside the system, who knew its secrets and its weaknesses. Ruth picked up one of the letters, her hands trembling as she read. This is from Harriet Tubman herself. She's asking Samuel to help guide escaped slaves through South Carolina. That's why Samuel finally came forward, Elias explained, not just because his conscience was bothering him, but because he realized the movement was alive again. He knew that exposing the Wilfred family's crimes would be just the beginning. It would open the door for a much larger reckoning. The room was silent as the implications sank in. They weren't just witnesses to one man's quest for justice. They were part of something much larger, a movement that was reshaping the entire nation. But Samuel died before he could make contact with the network, Moses said. So how did the federal marshals know to come here? Elias smiled, and in that smile was all the cunning and courage that had sustained him through his ordeal. Because Samuel taught me more than just the truth about Jeremiah Freeman's murder. He taught me how to write, how to think, how to plan. And before he died, he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would finish what he started. He pulled out another bundle of papers, copies of letters he had written, carefully hidden and sent through a network of sympathetic contacts that Samuel had established over the years. Every detail of the Wilfred crimes, every piece of evidence Samuel had gathered, every connection to the larger network of illegal slave trading, I documented it all and sent it north. The federal investigation didn't just happen by accident. It was planned, coordinated, part of a larger strategy to bring down the entire system. The revelation was staggering. What they had witnessed wasn't just one slave's rebellion. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been years in the making. So what happens now? Joshua asked. What do we do with this knowledge? Elias stood and walked to the window, looking out over the plantation that had been transformed from a place of suffering into a beacon of hope. We continue the work. We document every crime, every injustice, every act of cruelty that we've witnessed. We share our stories with the world, and we help others find their freedom. He turned back to the group, his young face serious with the weight of responsibility. The network is still out there, still growing, and they need people like us, people who have lived inside the system, who know its secrets, who can help tear it down from within. Sarah stood slowly, her aged frame somehow seeming stronger than it had in years. You're talking about dangerous work, work that could get us all killed. Yes, Elias agreed, but it's also work that could free every slave in America, work that could ensure that what happened to Samuel, to Jeremiah Freeman, to all of us, never happens to anyone else. The flames in the fireplace crackled and danced, casting their light on faces that had been transformed by hope and purpose. One by one, the former slaves of Magnolia Grove stood and pledged themselves to the cause that Samuel had died for, that Jeremiah Freeman had given his life to advance. As the night deepened around them, Elias shared the final secret that Samuel had entrusted to him, the names and locations of safe houses along the Underground Railroad, the coded messages that would identify them as allies, the plans for a coordinated uprising that would shake the very foundations of the slave system. The truth has set us free, Elias said, as the meeting drew to a close. But freedom isn't just about breaking our own chains. It's about making sure that no one else has to wear them. Outside, the wind carried the sound of singing from the slave quarters, not the mournful spirituals of bondage, but the joyful hymns of liberation. And somewhere in that music was the voice of Samuel Washington. Finally at peace, his long vigil ended, his legacy secured. The last secret had been revealed, the last lesson learned. The rebellion that had begun with one young man's refusal to remain silent had become something much larger, a movement that would echo through history, a testament to the power of truth and the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to accept injustice. In the years to come, the story of Elias and Samuel would be told and retold, inspiring countless others to stand up against oppression. The network they had helped to build would grow into a force that would ultimately help bring down the entire system of slavery. But tonight, in the flickering light of the fireplace, surrounded by the faces of his people, Elias simply smiled and whispered a prayer of gratitude to the ghost of an old slave who had taught him that the truth, once spoken, could never be silenced. The flames burned on, consuming the last lies of the old world and lighting the way to a new one.